All right, so welcome back. This week's lesson, I'm Doug Guzay again. This week's lesson is cave management, and I'm going to even tell you it's a little bit of any parkland or even resource management. And so hopefully, wherever you live, you might even be able to spot some of these concepts or practices in parks near you. And this is mostly material taken, if you've been following in some of the books that we suggested as good options. This is mostly taken from the Gillison 1996 text on caves. And so first I wanted to just talk about historically what have we used caves for. And we've used them actually for mining. Many times in the 1800s, especially in the early American West, when people were looking for gunpowder and bullets, and making their own bullets, and even in the Civil War in the US, people would go into caves and discover that they could find saltpeter or guano, which is bat droppings, and piles of it that they could mine and process and make gunpowder out of, use some of the phosphorus in it. There are actually a few caves that even have some hydroelectricity. They have enough of a turbine drop, just as there are waterfalls outside on the land's surface that have enough of a drop to make hydroelectric turbines spin. There's a couple of caves that have had that through the years. And then often, even in the 1800s, there were sanitariums. They were health and wellness places. There were various not necessarily modern ideas of what would be a healthy environment for someone, but there were times when people with tuberculosis were sent to a sanitarium in a cave with the idea that that was a constant environment, and not necessarily, I think the moisture is probably not good for tuberculosis nowadays is the current thinking, but at the time that was a thought that that might help people. So we have all those different things, but really I want to talk about how do we impact caves? And there are some impacts from tourism that are pretty significant. What are some of those impacts? Well, there are lights, and so lights, especially the older incandescent light bulbs, can generate heat. The light can actually allow algae to grow. Things that are photosynthetic don't usually find a way in a cave, but if the bacteria or molds or spores get in there, then you can actually grow them if you have lights. Many people have home gardens that have natural light or grow light on it. As people tour caves, their old skin cells and just the dust off your body, and some of us are losing our hair, all of those things you can shed what actually becomes lint. Sometimes people make fun of lint in their belly buttons, but that's just repeated time over time, dust that accumulates. I've seen one report of a cave that had over 50 pounds of lint collected over a 5-year period, and that was one of the major national parks in the US. Because of millions of people going through, each of us sheds microscopic amounts, and we don't notice that we're shedding it, or even just a little fuzz off of your vest or jacket or anything. And yet, over time, with 1 million people a year or more going through a major tourist cave, that can add up very quickly. Those things affect the energy level inside a cave and what we call the trophic status. It affects the biota, the biological life forms in a cave. The addition of lint and other material or light and algae that might provide other sources of food for other very small critters that are in caves, the bugs, beetles and springtails and things like that, mean that we affect that cave. And that's just from tourism. The other thing is that tourism also has an impact usually on the atmosphere inside a cave. If you open a second doorway next to if you build a visitor center and open a doorway or a tunnel into a cave from the visitor center, you might create, with a natural entrance somewhere else, a chance for the air to just flow straight through, and so what was a more humid cave might dry out. And again, just the effect of people going in might do that. And that affects the moisture in a cave. The moisture affects the different stalactites and stalagmites, the speleothems that might grow or exist on the walls. And that might even affect the carbon dioxide levels in the cave, either as we breathe out air or as the cave blows through more surface air rather than subsurface air. What other impacts are there? Well, let's take this another step deeper into other more detailed things. If I have a cave and I run it as a national park or even just as a private park, there's infrastructure. There's parking lots that increase the amount of water that runs off into a drainage. Maybe it focuses into a disappearing stream in a sinkhole, or maybe it diverts the water somewhere else into a surface river, and that water used to soak into the ground and into the cave and give me the drips through the ceiling that I actually wanted to create features. There may be septic tanks or sewage plants. We might even have hotels spring up around the entrance to a cave, or a very popular cave, or especially a national park around the entrance. All of these things would be things that affect what we call groundwater recharge, how water gets into the subsurface and from the subsurface into the cave. That makes us think about the land use and watersheds. In fact, there's also watersheds where the person who owns the cave only owns a little bit of land around that entrance, and they may be highly dependent upon what other people do with their land uses around it that affects how the water soaks into the ground and eventually flows into the cave if it's got any sort of a stream or seepage into it. And I mentioned already that people going through. Each of us, believe it or not, is a warm-hearted person. In fact, we're warm-blooded. And in fact, there are studies that say you and I, as we move through a cave, exert somewhere between 60 to 100 watts of the same heat energy as a 60 to 100 watt incandescent light bulb. So even if we just sort of average that out and say each of us is an 80 watt light bulb, if you've ever been in a really cold room and had an incandescent light, an 80 watt light bulb over a small amount of time can start to heat things up, and that's per person. So if we take 50 people in a group into a cave, we might actually add a lot of heat in there. You add all these things together, all these minor things. I found a listing that at one point in time, Carlsbad Caverns, a national park here in the United States, had over 1,400 lights, 65 kilometers of electrical wiring, 6 kilometers of paved pathways, 70 signs, and 56 drains, places where they had funneled water off their pathways into a drain into a different part of the cave. Those things all change the natural flow of the cave. I've mentioned the human body heat, like an 80 watt light bulb. I found a study, I believe it was in Scotland, where 80 to 100 tourists going through one of the larger caves could raise the temperature of the cave by 1 degree Celsius in less than 10 minutes. Does not sound like much, but when you realize that many caves in many parts of the world are only 10 to 15 degrees Celsius as a constant temperature, a change of 1 degree is 10% or almost 10% of the normal temperatures in that cave, and that's a big difference. If the average temperature I'm used to, where I live here in Missouri, it's often 75 degrees between the morning and the afternoon highs in the summertime, but if that went up an extra 10%, I would notice that it's a much different climate. Then there's wild caving. Some people say, well, those are tourist caves that you've mentioned, and I have been mentioning tourist caves. But the other idea that they come up with is wild caving. What if I'm joining a club and just crawling through and we don't put lights in the cave, we don't develop it? Well, those have impacts still. They're just different impacts. There's less of an impact in light from the lights. There's possibly more lint or debris from your clothing and from touching, bumping against formations as you may crawl through a tight passage. There may even be erosion because you no longer have a paved path. Different people walking through may compact mud or squishy sediments in a cave, and you make it harden. You're making more traffic if you crawl through parts of it. Who doesn't want to go in a wild cave that gets you all wet and muddy? Oftentimes that's some of the mystique, that's some of the fun of going on a wild tour rather than a paved tour. And some places, the wild cave actually has ladders or ropes to help you get up or down a certain section of what is not a normal walking passage, or where a walking modern tour might have a ramp or a staircase. And so sometimes you leave rope or ladder marks in the sediments on the floor of the cave. Sometimes they dig into the wall if they've been affixed there for a long time. You just get a lot of different effects. And in this day and age, in the United States especially, we're very sensitive to a thing called white nose syndrome. It's a syndrome that has been affecting the bat populations around America over the last 10 years or so. And there's a theory that it's it's a fungus that can turn into a spore when the environment is not conducive. We can discover that biology in a different discussion. But the key is those spores would be in the mud, and so if you get muddy caving clothes and then go into a different cave, you could transfer the foreign matter, the foreign mud, and the foreign spores into a new cave. And so that's another potential impact of wild caving. And then, as I've already said, there are places where people want to enlarge the entrance, or if there's a keyhole passage or a small squeeze at some point, which often, especially for commercial caves, makes the wild caving tour more exciting. But if over time I get more and more people through there, then some people have a tougher squeeze than others, and they may, just by their squeezing through, carry a little more dirt or mud out with them and enlarge that passage or that opening, which again could change airflow or water flow in the cave. Well, let's talk about the management. I said that's what this is about. Now that we've talked about some of the impacts and things that could happen to caves, let's actually talk about cave management, like I said, any park or resource management. And the first concept I want to start with is an older concept. I think it's a little bit outdated, but it has some value still, and that's a concept of carrying capacity. Carry things, and it's a concept that's widely used, I think still used in many areas in ecology, where they talk about how many cows or horses or you name it, a certain parcel of land can handle. Cattle ranchers may tell you that they know that for the type of cows they have, they could handle 100 head of cattle per 500 acres of their ranch based on where they live, what sort of grasses are on the ranch, and what sort of cattle they are. Horse farms or stables may tell you that they could handle 3 horses per 10 acres based on the kind of bluegrass and the climate that they have and the type of horses again. Those are all good things, and it is a useful concept that we have built upon. I would suggest we think about whether that's current or not. What are some of the reasons you might wonder if it's not current anymore or valid in a lot of land management? Well, many places have a statement in their zoning laws that says if you want to be on a private well and a septic tank system, you must have at least a 2-acre, in some places a 5-acre parcel of land. It was designed for zoning of rural areas and countryside that didn't have modern city sewer systems running through it, and building sewer systems to connect individual farms out in rural areas is rather expensive. Is that the carrying capacity of the land, that a family of 4 needs 2 acres? And if so, how do you get a city like Los Angeles or Atlanta or New York City? Clearly we have a way to address that and have a different carrying capacity than many other rural zoning laws have. That's why I think that the modern world you and I live in has lost the concept of carrying capacity. It still may be applicable for certain types of natural animals and stock, but I think even I know horse owners who would say, if I don't have enough acreage, I buy hay and I have it trucked in, or I have bales of hay brought in, or I get one of those big round bales that sometimes I've seen on the driving down the freeway. And so cattle farmers, horse ranchers, others will tell you that in the global world that we live in, just like New York City can import food, we truck in and fly in various types of food to the big cities. So the concept of carrying capacity loses some of its accuracy, and as long as you and I understand that and think it through, it's good. And then I want to go back to the carrying capacity. There's a well-known gentleman who's a researcher in caves, Tom Ailey. He runs a place called the Ozark Underground Lab here in Missouri. And he's rather famously quoted as saying the carrying capacity of a cave is 0. That you and I were not designed to live in caves, and caves are not designed to have enough food and energy supplies to provide for you and I. It has some small biota, it has some small critters, it has crickets and even bats that hang in there, but the number of things that can actually live completely in the cave is actually very small. So that's the concept of carrying capacity. I want to move into some of the other management measures that have been used historically before we finish off this session. What are some of those management measures? Well, the first one is harden the environment. If I'm thinking that I'm having too many impacts from people doing wild caving tours and they've tromped down a trail, or if I have this even in a natural above ground park, if there's a trail that gets built in, and people cut across the grass, eventually my best answer might be to pave that as a trail or put a rock chip trail. Many college campuses have that. I know our campus has some areas where students have decided that the concrete sidewalks really could be, you could get from one class to another much quicker just diagonally cutting across a lawn. And over time, as different students do that in different campuses, many universities now have crisscrossing paths of sidewalks so that people that want to go from one corner of a rectangle or a quad can go straight across, but people that are just going down the side of the quad can go to the next building. And suddenly you've added twice as many sidewalks. That's an impact, but it's also a management measure to harden the path. There's also a management measure to restrict the public information. If you think too many people are getting into a cave, what you do is you stop announcing when you've discovered new caves, or you stop publicizing where they are. Many caving clubs make their members now swear a statement that if you go in a cave that we get access to on private lands, we will not divulge that entrance location to others outside the club, because those may be people who don't have quite the sensitivity to some of the management measures or some of the resources in the cave or the park. Other places, they promote different parks, and that seems odd, but I'll talk about that more in a minute with the U.S. National Park System. Another option would be to increase the tourism supply. If I'm worried about one of my parks being overused, one of my caves being overused and overpopulated and too much heat build up from how popular it is, I just need to find another cave that's equally impressive or equally beautiful and announce that there's another cave, and maybe half the people will split off into that other one, and now each cave has a lesser impact from body heat going through it. I also could export tourism. That's sort of what that is, and the National Park System in the United States has been doing that. How many times in the last few years have you seen an article in the newspapers or the magazines or a travel magazine that says the 10 hidden gems in the National Park System, or the 10 least visited, most spectacular parks? That's a method or a mechanism to tell people, if we're loving the Grand Canyon or the Great Smoky Mountains or some of the other very big, very popular national parks to death, if we're getting too many visitors there, we'd like to point out to people, if you like the Grand Canyon, here's another canyon. Here's Canyon de Chelly National Monument. Here's Bryce Canyon and Zion Canyon. We can export that tourism sometimes. It's not always popular if you're a commercial business, or if you're one state, you don't necessarily want to send people away from your state parks to another state park if you can perhaps generate revenue or need that income. Another way of managing parkland is restrict the access. We put gates or require permits. Many parks in many big cities won't let you just show up and have a kid's birthday party or a softball tournament. You actually have to reserve the fields in advance and reserve picnic pavilions in advance for large groups, and that requires a permit. That's a type of a permit, whether they charge for it or not. There is gates. Many parks actually now have, certainly where I live, many of the city parks say park closes from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. That's just a common thing in many cities I've been in, that if you restrict the access or if you pull a gate closed across the entrance, you may limit the number of vehicles or whatever. And similarly, there are many places now where caves are having gates built across the entrance to the cave and anchored into concrete in the floor and covering the entrance, and have a lock that opens the gate, a gate in it that can be opened. But that's just a common parkland method. And the last, but certainly not least, perhaps the best and maybe one of the things we'd like you to take away from this class, is to reduce the visitor impact. In other words, if you and I are aware of lint and debris and accidentally touching something that we shouldn't touch or that might be damaged by our touch, or carrying mud or white-nosed spores into a cave, if we're educated, we might not do that. We might know how to avoid that. We also may have what's called low impact codes. Take only memories or photos and leave only footprints is sort of a slogan that some outdoor enthusiasts use in many areas. And that's a low impact code. That's a way of saying don't break things, don't leave trash behind, just take your photographs and your memories and leave your pictures. And that all leads us to the current style, which is called visitor impact management, which is a way to take qualitative goals of managing something and preserving the feeling and the sense of the place and turning those goals into a quantitative or measurable objective. And we'll get that in the next segment. So be back with you soon.